Unintended consequences don't have to be negative. I know, usually they are. Unexpected bad consequences usually result from imposing barriers and top-down controls that interfere with the natural functioning of markets. But unintended consequences can be positive. Usually this happens by removing barriers and burdens, giving people more freedom to solve their own problems. Expanding freedom creates unintended and unexpected benefits all the time. This video is part 1 of a 2-part Learn Liberty series. We will explore the real-life unintended climate benefits of free market policies. These were all implemented before climate change was so front and centre. Then, reflecting on what has worked in the past, the second video will look at free market solutions that could have even larger and fully intentional economic and climate benefits. A free trade consensus after World War II enabled the Japanese and Germans to decarbonise the global auto industry. After World War II, the victorious Allies finally abandoned the trade wars, which had triggered the Great Depression. They did so to accelerate the global recovery of the entire world, including the devastated economies of Germany and Japan. This new free trade consensus, along with the abandonment of price controls, set the stage for German and Japanese economic miracles. This included, notably, auto sectors that placed an emphasis on efficiency. Conflict in the Middle East triggered the 1973 Arab oil embargo, followed by a dozen years of high oil prices. Japanese and German auto manufacturers were already making the super efficient, low-cost, long-lasting automobiles that Americans and the world wanted. But free trade allowed this low-carbon innovation to spread globally. It decarbonized the automobile industry. From 1970 to 1990, average annual US vehicle CO2 emissions dropped 62%, from 1.3 to 0.5 tonnes per year per vehicle. Much of that was driven by foreign competition. The post-World War II free trade consensus lowered the cost of everything, including clean technologies. This allowed manufacturers to source raw materials and components from the most competitive suppliers, wherever they could be found, anywhere in the world. Ever since, free trade has powered the clean energy revolution globally. Until recently, that is. The Trump-Biden trade wars have reversed that. Rising tariffs have contributed to rising costs and, in turn, rising interest rates. New projects are now much more expensive than in 2023, and offshore wind developers cancelled 25% of all US projects under contract, despite all of the generous subsidies in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Protectionism only harms prosperity, but it also constricts innovation and decarbonisation. On the flip side, there is no incentive for decarbonising innovation that is better than the profit motive, which is best made possible by a big, wide-open global free market. 1970s telecom deregulation plus 1980s supply-side tax cuts drove the decarbonising productivity gains of the cell phone, PC, internet and smartphone revolutions, and now AI. Telecom deregulation paved the way for thousands of new companies to innovate, introducing new technologies and business models. Mobile phones led the way with the introduction of wireless technologies, which eliminated the emissions from producing and deploying hundreds of thousands of miles of wires. PCs and the internet soon followed, allowing massive productivity gains that saved on carbon emissions, including those from the manufacturing, mailing, and incineration of paper. Smartphones came next, eliminating emissions from the dozens of gadgets they replaced. Think fax machines, beepers, phone booths, phone lines, flashlights, calculators, calendars, compasses, notebooks, maps, tape recorders, stereos, TVs, books, magazines, newspapers. The list goes on. These advancements allowed for productivity gains across multiple industries that further reduced energy use, material use, and CO2 emissions. But this might not have happened so fast without the supply-side tax cuts introduced by the Reagan administration in 1981 and 1986. Throughout the 1970s, decades of reliance on Keynesian demand-side stimulus via government spending had resulted in a combination of high inflation and stagnation, aka stagflation. Many supply-siders argued the solution should be reduced tax rates on income from work and investment. This would encourage more work and investment, which would drive jobs and growth, overcoming stagflation. It would also expand supply, which would fight inflation. That's what happened. People worked and invested more. Inflation came down, stock market capitalization went up, people looked for new investment opportunities, and telecom deregulation opened up all kinds of business opportunities in the fast-growing tech sector. Soon, the market for new initial public offerings took off. It is no accident that companies like Apple, Microsoft, and scores of other companies were all able to go public in the mid-1980s, raising the cash needed to fuel exponential growth. These were the companies driving the decarbonisation of the productivity revolution. Climate change was not a political priority for the leaders who pushed telecom deregulation and supply-side tax cuts. But the free market policies they put in place nevertheless drove massive, rapid decarbonisation in ways that nobody could have foreseen. Now, with the emergence of AI, even more productivity gains seem to be in store. Lesson for policymakers: free market policies work and often have unintended benefits. A special supply-side tax cut, aka accelerated depreciation, drove the energy efficiency revolution. One particular kind of supply-side tax cut deserves special attention: accelerated depreciation, also known as full capital expensing. Prior to 1981, if a US company bought a $30 million plant with a life expectancy of 30 years, they could deduct $1 million per year for 30 years as an expense against income. The supply-siders around Reagan pointed out that if companies could take all of that expense in 1, 2, or 3 years, the cost of financing new investments would drop dramatically. This would, of course, create more jobs, more growth, and also fight inflation by expanding supply. And they were right about all of this, as became clear after accelerated depreciation went into effect in 1981. The impacts were immediate, but they did not anticipate a major unintended side effect. Accelerated depreciation helped drive the energy efficiency revolution. It turns out that in a free market, with competition among suppliers, new equipment is almost always cleaner and more efficient, with less emissions than older equipment. So, when we make it cheaper to invest in new property, plants and equipment, that creates a bias for accelerated investment in newer, cleaner technologies, and for retirement of older, dirtier technologies. Full expensing, by simply reducing the cost of new investment in equipment, accelerates the natural capitalist process of improving products and technologies across the board. This is a lesson to keep in mind for future climate policy design, for it stands in sharp contrast to conventional subsidies that do pick winners and losers. Such subsidies create barriers to innovative technologies not on the politically favoured list. They also hold back successful innovators who are rendered uncompetitive as a direct result of government intervention. In autumn of 2023, the UK made full expensing permanent. In the US, as of January 2024, full expensing was due to expire. The benefits, if more widely known, could help make the policy permanent. Deregulation of natural gas in the 1980s and electrical power markets in the 1990s. The Natural Gas Wellhead Decontrol Act deregulated the natural gas market. This allowed producers equal access to interstate gas pipelines. At the same time, it opened the market to new competition and simultaneously removed price caps that had discouraged investment in innovation. These reforms led to the fracking revolution, replacing coal with natural gas, which emits up to 60% less CO2. According to the International Energy Agency, in the US between 2011 and 2018, switching from coal to natural gas reduced CO2 emissions by 255 million metric tons. Electric power markets competition played a big role. A recent study comparing competitive versus monopoly power markets in the US shows, surprise, surprise, competitive markets have decarbonised 66% faster than uncompetitive markets. These pro-competition reforms were undertaken for economic reasons. Few of their champions had even heard about climate change. Fewer still predicted a climate benefit. And yet, now we know competition leads to innovation, which leads to accelerated decarbonisation. The 1986 conservation easement tax deduction led to the regrowth of millions of acres of trees in the US. The tax reforms of 1986 created a robust tax deduction for conservation easement. Essentially, landowners could promise to conserve certain parts of their property or restrict their use in exchange for tax deductions. Keeping land under private ownership meant that incentives were aligned. The owners wanted their lands to be healthy and therefore profitable, and obviously the rest of humanity also wanted healthy land. Since the tax reform, roughly 20 million acres of forest have been regrown on private lands. That many acres of trees represents an almost unfathomable amount of carbon removal, even though the law was passed before climate change was even a thing. In 2022 alone, the world lost 10 million acres of forests, much of that in rainforest countries with poorly defined property rights, and governments owning way more forest land than they can possibly protect. Imagine the millions of acres of rainforest land that could be protected and regrown if those countries established a US-style private conservation framework. So, whilst we typically think of unintended consequences as bad, when policies expand freedom, the unintended consequences are often very good. All of these examples were adopted at a time when climate change was not expected to become a major global issue. But because they prioritised freedom and rewarded beneficial innovation, they've had benefits for the climate. Of course, many climate activists think the solution to climate change is just the opposite: to restrict freedom, to impose more regulations, and to grant subsidies to green industries. I think we should follow the evidence, and instead of restricting innovation, let's unleash it to reap the climate benefits. But that's just me. Let us know what you think in the comments. In our next video, we'll show how these free market policies of the 1980s and 90s and their unintended climate benefits have inspired the development of a new generation of international free market climate solutions for the future. All of them build on the classical liberal policies of free trade, inclusive competition, low taxes, private economic rights, and ultimately, the expansion of freedom.